Imagine this for a second. You step into the Middle Ages expecting knights, castles, honor, and heroic legends. But what if I told you that behind every shining sword and every holy prayer was a darker truth so disturbing that most history books quietly look away? And if you skip this story, you will miss the side of the medieval world that shaped fear, power, and suffering for centuries, because the Middle Ages were not just an age of faith and bravery. They were also an age where pain was normal, cruelty was organized, and survival often meant losing your humanity. And it starts in a place nobody likes to talk about, the everyday life of ordinary people, where waking up was already a risk because disease did not knock. It kicked the door down, where a simple cut could turn into a death sentence, and where the smell of death was not rare, it was familiar, because towns had no sanitation, waste flowed through the streets, and rats ruled the shadows, carrying plagues that could wipe out entire families in days. And here is the first uncomfortable twist. People did not understand why they were dying, so they blamed God, demons, witches, or their own neighbors, which meant fear turned people against each other. And when fear meets ignorance, something ugly always follows. Because in the Middle Ages just was not about truth, it was about power, and courts did not search for facts, they searched for confessions, and confessions were forced out with tools designed to break the body and the mind, racks that stretched bones, iron boots that crushed legs, devices that slowly pulled nails from fingers, all done in the name of law or faith. And here is the question nobody asks: how many innocent people screamed lies just to make the pain stop? And this darkness did not stop at prisons. It walked straight into churches, because while faith gave hope, it also gave control. And the church, the most powerful institution of the Middle Ages, decided not only how people prayed, but how they thought, what they feared, and who they hated. And this is where the line between salvation and terror completely disappeared, because if you questioned authority, if you thought differently, or if you simply stood out, you could be labeled a heretic. And once that word touched your name, your life was already over. Public trials became spectacles. Crowds gathered not to stop cruelty but to watch it, and executions were not hidden. They were celebrated. Fire burned bodies while people believed they were saving souls. And here comes another twist. Many of the victims were women, because the medieval world feared female independence, intelligence, and healing knowledge, which is why midwives and healers were often accused of witchcraft, tortured until they confessed to crimes they did not understand, and executed for knowing too much. And ask yourself this: how many lives were destroyed simply because someone was afraid of what they could not control? But the darkness goes even deeper, because war in the Middle Ages was not glorious, it was brutal, slow, and personal. Soldiers did not just fight armies, they burned villages, slaughtered farmers, and used starvation as a weapon, and peasants, who had no armor and no voice, paid the highest price, forced to feed lords who would never protect them, taxed until hunger became normal, and punished for crimes as small as hunting to survive. And this brings us to feudalism, a system that promised protection but delivered dependence, where most people were born into a life they could never escape, where your future was decided the moment you were born, and dreaming of freedom was dangerous because hope itself could be punished. And just when you think it cannot get worse, look at childhood in the Middle Ages. Because children were not protected, they were prepared to suffer early. Many worked from a very young age, many died before they could speak full sentences, and many were married off before they could understand love. And here is the emotional beat that hits hardest. Parents often did not allow themselves to fully love their children, not because they were cruel, but because death was so common that attachment felt like inviting pain. And yet life went on. Laughter still existed, songs were still sung, which makes this era more disturbing, because it shows how humans can adapt to horror, normalize cruelty, and survive inside systems that slowly destroy them. And now comes the part history real. Why admits the Middle Ages were not dark because people were stupid or evil. They were dark because power thrived on fear, because control was easier when people were scared, sick, and divided. And the real secret is this: many of the tools of oppression, public shaming, force, confessions, blind loyalty, fear-based authority, did not disappear with castles and swords. They evolved, they changed shape, and they followed us into the modern world. And that is the final reveal. The darkest side of the Middle Ages is not just something buried in the past. It is a mirror showing what happens when power goes unquestioned, when fear replaces empathy, and when truth becomes less important than control. And if this story makes you uncomfortable, that is exactly the point, because history is not meant to comfort us. It is meant to warn us. And the real question is not how dark the Middle Ages were, but how close we still are to repeating them. Picture this continuation as the shadows growing longer, because once you peel back the surface of medieval life, you realize the darkness was not just occasional, it was systemic, woven into daily routines, so deeply that people stopped questioning it. And this is where part 2 begins. In the homes of ordinary families where hunger was a constant guest, sitting silently in the corner because harvests failed often, weather was unpredictable, and one bad season could mean watching your children slowly weaken. And here is the cruel twist. Food exists, but it was controlled, locked behind the walls of lords and monasteries. So while peasants starved, storehouses stayed full, guarded by law and punishment, and stealing a loaf of bread to survive could cost a hand, an eye, or a life. And ask yourself this: what kind of world teaches people that property is more sacred than human life? And that idea did not come from nowhere, it was enforced. Because medieval punishment was designed not just to hurt but to scare everyone watching. Stocks in town squares where people were mocked and beaten, bodies displayed after executions as warnings, heads placed on spikes at city gates, all sending one clear message: obey or suffer. And this fear-based order worked, because fear spreads faster than truth. And while people were terrified on the ground, the elite lived in a different reality above. Nobles dressed in silk, feasted endlessly, and talked about honor while their power depended on violence. And here comes another uncomfortable turn. Knights, the supposed heroes of the Middle Ages, were often trained killers whose loyalty was bought, not earned. And when there was no war, they did not suddenly become gentle. They turned their aggression inward, bullying peasants, abusing women, and settling disputes with steel. And the law rarely stopped them, because the law served those who already had power. And speaking of women, the medieval world was especially cruel to them, because a woman's body was treated as property, first of her father, then of her husband, and her voice carried little weight in courts, which meant abuse was easy to hide and impossible to escape. And marriage, often romanticized today, was for many women a survival contract, entered into young, sometimes in childhood, with men they barely knew. And once married, there was no real exit, because divorce was almost impossible, and running away meant starvation, punishment, or death. And this is where another dark layer appears: motherhood, because giving birth in the Middle Ages was terrifying. With no real medical knowledge, no hygiene, and no pain relief, women faced death every time they went into labor, and men did not survive, which meant families were constantly rebuilding after loss, and children grew up surrounded by grief they could not name. And yet, the church often taught that this suffering was holy, that pain brought people closer to God, which raises a chilling question: how much suffering can be justified when it is labeled divine? And religion did not only shape beliefs, it controlled time itself. Bells decided when people worked, rested, prayed, and slept. Calendars revolved around holy days. And missing church was not just spiritual failure, it was social suicide, because neighbors watched each other closely, and suspicion was a powerful weapon, because if you were different, quieter, poorer, or simply unlucky, rumors could turn into accusations, and accusations could turn into trials, and trials rarely ended well. Echo's medieval trials were not about evidence, they were about confession, and confession was extracted through pain. And here comes another twist that feels almost unbelievable. Many people truly believed that torture revealed truth, that an innocent person would be saved by God while a guilty one would break, which meant when someone confessed under agony, it only confirmed what people already wanted to believe. And once someone was labeled guilty, their entire family suffered too. Property seized, names ruined, futures erased, and this collective punishment kept everyone obedient, silent, and afraid. And fear also shaped medicine, because sickness was everywhere, but understanding was not, so treatments were often worse than the disease. Bloodletting, burning, cutting, prayers instead of cures, and doctors, when they existed, were expensive and unreliable, so most people relied on folk healers, the same healers who could later be accused of witchcraft if a patient died, which means helping others was dangerous, because failure could be fatal in more ways than one. And while disease quietly killed millions, war loudly finished the job. Because medieval wars did not end quickly, they dragged on for years, destroying land, crops, and lives, and soldiers lived off the land, which meant robbing civilians. And rape was treated as an unfortunate side effect, not a crime, and villages learned to fear approaching armies more than wild animals, because at least animals killed quick. And after war came famine, and after famine came plague, and this cycle repeated again and again, generation after generation, until suffering felt normal, expected, inevitable. And here is the emotional beat that cuts deepest. Many people truly believed they deserved this life, that suffering was their fate, assigned by God at birth. which crushed the idea of resistance before it could even form. And yet, rebellions did happen. Desperate uprisings by peasants pushed beyond survival, but these rebellions were crushed with extreme violence, leaders executed publicly, followers hunted down, and the message reinforced: you cannot escape your place. And this brings us to knowledge, because knowledge itself was controlled. Books were rare, expensive, and written in languages ordinary people could not read, which meant truth was filtered through those in power. And when information is limited, lies thrive, myths replace facts, and authority goes unquestioned. And here comes the realization most people miss. The Middle Ages were not just dark because of violence, they were dark because of silence, because millions lived and died without their stories ever being recorded, without their pain ever being acknowledged. And history remembered kings and battles, not starving families or tortured innocents. And as this part comes to a close, the darkness does not fade, it tightens, because the deeper truth is this: the medieval world perfected systems of control that did not rely on instant force, but on belief, routine, fear, and normalization. And once people accept suffering as normal, oppression no longer needs chains. It lives inside the mind. And that is where part 3 will go, into how this darkness slowly cracked, how doubt crept in, and how even in the bleakest age, sparks of change began to glow, quietly, dangerously, and at great cost, waiting for the moment the world would finally be forced to confront what it had become.